Hi there, everyone. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Ted Naiman. Dr. Naiman is a board-certified family medicine physician at a major medical center in Seattle, and he focuses on research into how to use diet and exercise to optimize our health. So Dr. Naiman has written what I think is the best practical nutrition book I have ever read. It's called the PE Diet, which is Protein to Energy Diet. And I'm going to let him explain it in more detail to you. But for those who know me, I've always been a fan of prioritizing protein in our diets. And this book answers all those questions for you about how much we should be eating and our ratio of fats and carbs and so on. It's also a beautifully illustrated book. Dr. Naiman drew all the illustrations himself, and for visual learners, I think this makes the concepts really easy to grasp. So I highly recommend this book. I'd love to see everyone in the country following the principles outlined. Dr. Naiman has a website called Burn Fat, Not Sugar, and you can buy a PDF of this book from there, and it's also on Amazon. He's also very active on Twitter and Facebook, and we'll put all the links as to where you can find him in the show notes and on the website. So Dr. Naiman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, wow. Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure. So I was just wondering, would you start by giving us your backstory and filling people in on who you are and why you decided to write this book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. I would love to. So I got a mechanical engineering degree, undergraduate, and then I couldn't get a job. So I was pretty much a failure at mechanical engineering, mostly because I'm here in the Pacific Northwest, and Boeing, the aerospace industry here, laid off a bunch of mechanical engineers the year I got out of school. So nobody in my class could get a job, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. And just kind of on a whim, I went to medical school, and it was really just the absolute last minute decision ever. I applied on the last day you could, and I never even took general biology. And so next thing I know, I'm in medical school. Well, I was raised a Seventh-Day-Adventist. My mother's a Seventh-Day-Adventist. And so I was a vegetarian for off and on pretty much 20 years. And I was raised vegetarian. I went to vegetarian Adventist schools, and I went to a vegetarian medical school, Loma Linda University, which is in Southern California, east of Los Angeles. And some people might recognize Loma Linda as being one of these famous quote unquote blue zones where everybody lives a long time and everyone's, on a plant-based diet and all this kind of stuff. So I went to school at Loma Linda. I had a vegetarian background and upbringing, and I'm at this vegetarian school. And then I did my residency in South Carolina. And at the time, it was the #1 state in the United States for a whole bunch of bad things, including obesity and type 2 diabetes and heart attacks and strokes and all sorts of metabolic disease. So I saw tons of extremely severe type 2 diabetes and complications and obesity and insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. And so from very early on, I adopted a large interest in the type 2 diabetes spectrum of diseases, metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and obesity, and the various diseases that were associated with insulin resistance. Now, in medical school, they kind of taught us about diet, but the general thought was, well, you should eat a vegetarian diet because it's healthy and it's the right thing to do ethically and morally, but diet's not very powerful. And so the message for us was that people who have diabetes, it's mostly genetic. You have diabetes because your parents had diabetes. And, if both your parents are obese, there's an 80% chance you'll be obese. and if both your parents are diabetic, there's an 80% chance you'll be diabetic. And it's really just bad genetics, and we should feel sorry for these people. And yes, of course, they should eat a healthy vegetarian diet because it's just the right thing to do. But it's really all about the medication, right? So here are the drugs you put people on when you have diabetes, and then they will inevitably get worse. And then you put them on insulin. And this is how you gradually increase the insulin doses higher and higher and higher. And these are the complications you can expect from diabetes. And then, 75% of diabetics die of giant heart attack, and that's just how it goes. And so this was kind of the angle I was coming at it from. I was told that all diabetics are going to get worse, and you just have to kind of feel sorry for them because it's not their fault, because they had this bad genetics, and that's just the lot they were dealt in life. And you just titrate their insulin doses higher and higher. And I personally was never really in great health. I never really had very good health or body composition. So internally, I felt that diet was not a very powerful lever for health because I was allegedly on the healthiest diet that somebody could have, and my health kind of sucked. And so diet was just sort of a meh for me. And then I think what really caught my attention was a patient, a type 2 diabetic patient of mine in my internship. And this was, 20 years ago now, or more than this, was 22 years ago. And this patient, I was so used to having patients come in who had just gotten worse and worse and worse, right? Gaining weight, higher blood sugars, higher hemoglobin A1Cs, more diabetic neuropathy, retinopathy, nephropathy, all these complications and problems. And one day someone came in and I looked at the patient, I looked at his chart, and I was like, wow, you just lost 30 pounds and your blood sugar is normal. And this guy was like, yeah, I feel awesome. I've never felt this good. I even stopped taking my medications. He had normal blood pressure, normal blood sugar. He felt great. And I asked this guy, what the hell did you do? Because I have to know so I can tell other people to do whatever it is you did. And he throws down a copy of the original Dr. Atkins book, Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution. And he was like, oh, I just read this book and it told me to not eat carbs, and that's what I did. And next thing you know, I'm just not that hungry. I lost all this weight. I feel awesome. And so I went to my instructors in internship and I said, you have got to see this guy. He totally changed his diet and he feels awesome and all this great stuff happened. And they just kind of looked at me and said, well, what happened to his total cholesterol? And I admitted that I didn't even really look. I didn't even notice. I didn't, and they're like, oh, well, go look. And sure enough, his total cholesterol had gone up, 10 or 20 points. And they're like, oh, great. He probably died of a heart attack in the parking lot. And you're the worst doctor ever. And way to go. And under no circumstances are you allowed to recommend this sort of diet for anyone ever at all, period. Goodbye. And so that really got me thinking, what is going on here? Why is this single dietary intervention so powerful? And why is it that absolutely everything you could measure subjectively or objectively got better for this person, except for his total and LDL cholesterol? And I just spent the next 20 years researching the impact of diet on health, and specifically macronutrients on diet and health. And so I've just been researching the heck out of this my entire career. And it's just been hugely interesting to me, both personally and professionally. And I have been recommending at least some degree of carbohydrate restriction for a lot of my patients ever since then. And that's pretty much the story. That's how I got to where I'm at. And that's what brought me to write the book and to be in the position where I'm at currently.
Oh, it's a fascinating story, and it's really great to be talking to a vegetarian or an ex-vegetarian, and because as you say, that university produces so much of the research and publications about diet and has a huge influence, doesn't it, on how to diet?
The Adventists are, they're basically just a huge plant-based propaganda machine. And everybody has heard about them and their message and their brands of food and what they've done to, breakfast cereal, for example, with Kellogg and all that sort of thing. It's really pretty far-reaching stuff, and it shapes a lot of what everyone thinks and believes in the nutrition world. The Adventists are actually very good at education, and they really have a lot of tentacles into the educational system, and they kind of spread this plant-based message more than anybody else. They basically originated it. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, they have or have had up until recently a great influence on the medical fraternity in New Zealand and Australia as well. And GPs would basically hand out sanitariums, food guidelines to patients.
Sanitarium.
Yeah.
Sanitarium is huge down there, and it's basically all this Adventist plant-based propaganda that started with Ellen G. White, having a vision that humans shouldn't eat animals because it was wrong somehow. It's just really, really, really interesting where it all came from and where we ended up with the plant-based thing.
Yeah, well, I think, I've shared the masturbation cornflakes story. Pretty amusing,
Very fascinating. It's fascinating. And I personally and professionally think that breakfast cereal is probably the single most evil thing ever when it comes to the diabetes epidemic, because you're literally eating this incredibly high glycemic thing first thing in the morning with a ridiculous glycemic load and glycemic index and essentially no protein at all. And it really just sets your metabolic tone for the whole rest of the day. I mean, this just starts people off on this unbelievable carbohydrate roller coaster. So I have a super deep hatred for breakfast cereal. Like that's my least favorite. Soda's evil. Yes, I would say that soda is probably more evil, and sugar sweetened beverages are probably more evil. But breakfast cereal is bad. It might be worse because it has this health halo, right? It's so healthy. I mean, it has no saturated fat or cholesterol. It's heart healthy. I mean, it says so right on the label. So here you have a food that's actually got a health halo, and people will go out of their way to eat Cheerios or some crap if they're trying to get healthy. That some people would think that's a healthy thing to do, and it's just not. It's not that good.
And it's fed to the kids too. Like we're shoving this stuff down our kids' throats as well. And New Zealand, this exploding childhood diabetes and childhood obesity. And I think parents don't realise shoving this cereal down their kids' throats not really such a good thing.
No, I mean, they actually assume that's one of the healthiest things they can give their kids, and it's terrible.
Would you just expand a little bit for people about the process of, glucose, insulin, personal fat threshold sort of, and you talk a lot about energy toxicity. Would you sort of delve into that a bit and explain that?
Sure, absolutely. All right. So when you eat, first of all, I talk about this a lot in the book, and I kind of break down what is eating, right? And so animals have to constantly eat other living organisms to be alive. We either eat other animals or plants. And when we eat them, we're incorporating the protein and minerals and energy from these other living organisms into our bodies. And I sort of divide food into protein and minerals, which plants draw up out of the soil, and energy, which is basically high energy carbon-carbon bonds that plants create using solar energy and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then plants take this solar energy and store it as either carbohydrates or fats, both of which are just strings of high energy carbon bonds. So animals ingest all this dietary energy, carbs or fats. We ingest protein and minerals, and we incorporate all of this into our bodies. And the problem with the modern food supply is that we've taken a bunch of energy out of food, which is basically refined carbs and refined fats, and we've dumped it into the food supply. And then when you're eating whole foods, you usually get some protein and minerals and some energy at a very nice ratio, right? If you just kill an animal and eat the whole thing, you'll get a lot of protein, you'll get a lot of minerals, and you'll get some fat energy. If on the other hand, you refine carbs like sugar or flour, and you refine fats like oil, and then you just eat something like a donut, which is just pure refined carbs and refined fats, you've gotten a whole bunch of dietary energy, this high energy carbon bonds, but you have not gotten any protein or minerals. And so that drives overeating, because humans have this incredibly powerful protein satiety drive, and you will eat and eat and eat until you get enough protein, and only then will you stop eating. So when we were hunter-gatherers, you just went out and killed an animal and ate the whole thing, and you maybe found some plant foods and ate those, and you got this very nice combination of protein and minerals, as well as energy, carbs and fats. But in the modern food environment, where 60% of human calories come from wheat, rice, and corn, and these super low protein grains that are very high in carbohydrate, and because we have so many refined carbs and refined fats like sugar, flour, and oil, we're all eating a whole bunch of energy, and then we have to overeat that energy to get enough protein to not be hungry. So, for example, if you're eating a chicken breast, you eat a chicken breast, you get a ton of protein, you're just not that hungry afterwards. But if you're eating, French fries, which are potatoes and oil, and they're maybe 6% protein, you have to massively overeat the carbs and fats from those French fries to get enough protein to not be hungry. And this is what we call protein dilution. The protein and minerals in the food supply have been diluted with refined carbs and refined fats, and so everyone is forced to overeat non-protein energy in order to get enough protein for satiety. And then the energy toxicity comes in because you're overeating energy in an attempt to not be hungry. And then we have to store that energy. All of the fat that you eat gets stored in your fat cells. All the carbohydrate you eat displaces fat oxidation and is fat sparing. So one way or another, eating carbs and fats contributes to your fat mass. And then energy toxicity is where you've overexpanded all of your fat cells and you run out of place to put fat inside your body. And that's literally what insulin resistance is. It's running out of places to store fat. And so you have too much triglyceride in your bloodstream, for example, which is fat energy with no place to go. And then eventually, when all the cells in your body are overfilled with fat, your cells start refusing glucose. So now your glucose is too high all the time. And that's what type 2 diabetes is. Type 2 diabetes is literally just end-stage insulin resistance, where all your cells are filled with fat, and now they all refuse glucose as well. And so all this energy just circulates in your bloodstream, glucose and triglycerides, and it has no place to go. And that's energy toxicity, basically, which is my term for metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia or anything on the type 2 diabetes spectrum.
And so then these overfed toxic fat cells, then they're starting to release chemicals and hormones back into the body, causing, further metabolic disruption. Is that correct?
Correct, right. So basically, all of your fat cells have a maximum diameter. And once you have hit or exceeded this diameter, your fat cells are extremely unhappy and they're literally inflamed. They're literally sick and dying. You have all these macrophages who are cleaning up inflamed or sick or dying fat cells. And that's why people who are energy toxic and really overweight have very high systemic inflammation, because this overfilled fat is extremely inflammatory. And then you get all these cytokines, and then you get all this inflammatory markers. And being quote unquote over fat is one of the most inflammatory things you can have, which is really another big driver of vascular disease and other complications of diabetes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you were talking earlier about your patient, you know, when you were doing your residency, and your mentors saying, well, had you checked their cholesterol levels? But really it's it's kind of this inflammatory process that is leading to the heart disease, isn't it, rather than the actual cholesterol levels themselves?
Correct, right. So in other words, cholesterol can be just harmless. Like, everyone out there walking around with perfect coronary arteries and no vascular disease at all has plenty of cholesterol. They have, a cholesterol level of 200 or whatever. They have lots of cholesterol. They have lots of LDL. It's supposed to be there. But what they haven't done is oxidized it and glycated it and damaged their endothelial lining and created a problem. So the cholesterol is part of the atherosclerotic process, but in and of itself, it's quite harmless, and everyone has cholesterol, even if they have no vascular disease. So the cholesterol is not really the problem. The problem is inflammation and glycating and oxidizing your cholesterol and then damaging your endothelial lining, and that causes vascular disease. And I think that a lot of people don't see the forest for the trees when it comes to cholesterol. They're like, look, this artery is clogged with cholesterol, with LDL particles, so LDL causes vascular disease. Well, that's kind of like saying gravity causes plane crashes. Yes, gravity will be part of the process in every single plane crash. But what about all the planes that are not crashing despite gravity? Clearly, gravity is not the root cause of plane crashes. It's just involved in the final common pathway. So we kind of had the wrong idea about cholesterol. It's we really miss the big picture. And so I have tons of patients whose total cholesterol is quite high, their LDL is quite high, but their CT coronary calcium score is 0, and their inflammatory markers are extremely low, and all of their numbers are perfect, and they're basically never going to have vascular disease. So I really think that's kind of not a very helpful marker.
And that's one of the problems. People go to their GP, they try lowering their carbohydrates, and then end up with that problem. Their cholesterol levels go up a little bit, but like you say, their glucose, their insulin, their inflammatory markers, their triglycerides all come down, but that's ignored, and they're told, stop this diet, don't do this diet, you're going to kill yourself.
Right. And personally, my total cholesterol is higher now than when I was a vegan. But or a vegetarian rather, I was never a vegan, I was a vegetarian. But every other marker you could measure is better. So I'm really, I'm asking myself the question, how bad could this really be? And the answer is not that bad.
So how do people tap into these fat stores? You've got a really beautiful illustration in your book with the oil tanker, which I really love. I think that just describes the situation perfectly. Do you want to expand on that and then explain how they manage to tap into these fat stores and start to burn fat instead of, carbs for energy?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Okay. So anytime you eat fat, it is actually stored directly in your adipocytes. That's the way the system works. Carbs are a little bit different. When you eat carbohydrate, your liver and your muscles will hold some glycogen, some stored glucose in the form of glycogen. Your muscles can hold about 300 grams, and your liver can hold about 100 grams. But once you've filled up all of these glycogen stores, any carbohydrate you eat just immediately displaces fat oxidation. There's like a giant seesaw in your metabolism where if there are no carbohydrates coming in from your diet, you're burning 100% fat. And if there's a lot of carbohydrate coming in from your diet, you're burning 0% fat. So the seesaw, the teeter-totter, or whatever you want to call it, will go from completely burning fat to completely burning carbohydrate. And glucose coming in from the diet is what controls that entirely. So if you eat no glucose all day long, by the end of the day, you will be burning 100% fat. If, on the other hand, all of your meals are very high carbohydrate, you will be burning exclusively glucose all day long. Now, if you're super thin, if you're thin in today's modern food environment, this very high carbohydrate diet that everyone's eating, then you really don't have to worry about it, right? Anyone who's thin right now is probably fine. They're not going to be they're doing okay, even with the carbohydrates displacing fat oxidation. But if you're overweight and you have a lot of fat that you want to burn, the last thing you want to do is eat a bunch of carbohydrate because that displaces all the fat oxidation. So you're just burning your carbs from your last meal all day long, and you're never really tapping into stored body fat. At the same time, you also wouldn't want to necessarily eat a ton of extra fat because you've already got too much fat inside your body. So what would you want to eat? Well, you want to eat protein and fiber and minerals and things that give you satiety with less dietary energy, especially carbs. And then you can upregulate your fat oxidation. A lot of people are kind of bad at burning fat. They're not used to it. They eat, your average American eats 300 grams of carbs a day. They're eating carbs every 2 hours. They're eating 8 times a day in a 16-hour waking window. So it's like breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. And you're eating all these carbohydrates. So you're very, very bad at just running your body off of stored body fat. You're always hungry for more carbs and more glucose. And so people, you eat breakfast cereal and your blood sugar goes way up. And then a few hours later, you feel that sugar falling and you're not good at running off of stored body fat. So then you eat a snack, and then you feel your blood sugar go up and then back down again. You're starving a couple hours later. You need another snack. You're basically just snacking on carbs all day long. And every time your glucose gets low, you're not comfortable burning stored body fat. And so you're what we call glucose dependent and you're not fat adapted. And so you're kind of on this blood sugar roller coaster all day, just going from one carbohydrate feeding to the next. There's a lot of ways to improve your fat adaptation or your ability to just run off of stored body fat. Well, one way to do that is never eat any carbs. If you just go a really long time without carbohydrate, if you go 24 hours without eating any carbohydrate, you're literally forcing your body to run off of fat instead, which improves fat oxidation. You literally upregulate the fat burning pathways, your fat mobilization from your fat cells, the fat oxidation in your mitochondria, all the fat transport, it all gets upregulated and you kind of force yourself to get better at burning fat. It's almost like a form of metabolic exercise. You can do that by just not eating, like an intermittent fasting protocol. You can do that by eating carbohydrates very infrequently, like only eating carbs once a day. You could do that by just being on a low-carb diet, so you're always having to get more energy from fat. Exercise will also deplete glycogen and force you to switch over to fat burning. So people can use high-intensity exercise, intermittent fasting, carb restriction, carb cycling, or any of these techniques to get more fat adapted. And then when your body is better at just running off of stored body fat, which is what your body's designed to do, you're a lot less subjected to these extreme hungers when your breakfast cereal and your juice and your toast runs out 2 hours after you've eaten them. So it's this fat adaptation process that I think is probably the single most beneficial part of low carbohydrate diets. And I talk a lot about this in the book.
Yes, you do. And I think, a lot of people are now, even in New Zealand, keto is becoming popular, turning into sort of low carb. But there's always, now we've got this added fat to it. So now we've replaced the carbohydrate energy source with a fat energy source. And to me, it seems like we're replacing carbohydrate treats with keto treats now, and so people are still running into trouble. They lose, 6 or 10 kgs of weight, and then they stall out, and then they say, well, keto doesn't work either. And I know you've got some good insights about that.
Right, absolutely. So honestly, I think the entire keto-verse is stalled out, way fatter than they want to be. And what happens is people go on a very low carbohydrate diet, and after a few weeks they get fat adapted, which is awesome, which is a huge beneficial property of low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. But then you run into this situation where once carbohydrates are out of the picture, it really just comes down to straight up fat balance. If the grams of fat you eat every day equal the grams of fat you burn every day, you're never going to lose any more weight at all. So this is kind of a two-level thing. In order to get better at burning fat, you avoid eating carbohydrates, and then you force your body to get better at burning fat. And then if you want to burn more stored body fat, you also eat less fat. And then not only are you burning fat, but the fat that you burn has to come from inside your own body. So by reducing both carbs and fats, you're not only forcing your body to burn fat, but you're forcing your body to burn its own fat. Well, how do you do that without just being starving all the time? You eat way more protein or fiber or minerals or foods that have a low energy density, foods that are low in carbs and low in fat. This is the low energy diet, which is really, things like lean meat and green vegetables and things that are essentially low carb and low fat at the same time. And it's like a ketogenic diet without all the refined added fats, without the butter, the heavy cream, the oils, the coconut oil, the fat bombs, the nuts, the high fat dairy, the keto snacks, the keto all, like you said, all of these keto snacks that keep people in a positive fat balance where they're eating just as much fat or more than they're burning.
And your book illustrates that beautifully. I love your sort of like, you've got a fan graph kind of, and so you can, depending on a person's needs, you explain quite clearly their protein to fat and carb, or protein to energy ratio, you call it. So, you're quite open about eating vegetables or fats. You're not a anti-vegetable kind of person. Do you want to explain that a bit? So you were saying, someone who's leaner can get away with more, whereas someone who has more body fat, they'll need to have leaner protein, maybe more fiber.
Right. So in the book we graph out, we literally create a vector based on your protein to energy ratio, which is the grams of protein you're eating divided by the grams of net carbs and fat you're eating, or non-protein energy. And if you're trying to get thinner, you basically aim your vector a little bit higher than you were before. You try to eat a little bit higher protein percentage at a little bit lower carbohydrate and fat intake. And of course, that's infinitely variable. If you're super lean and you're running triathlons, you're going to need way more energy. You can get away with a lot lower protein energy ratio. But if you're really overweight and you have a lot of fat to lose and you're fairly sedentary, you want to aim as high as you can on the protein energy ratio. You want to eat more, maybe just the leanest proteins you can find. You might want to eat, skinless poultry and fish and egg whites and whey powder or something like that. Most of the time, for the average person in maintenance, I really like sort of a protein to energy ratio of about 1-to-1. So a gram of protein for every gram of non-protein energy. And that's the kind of ratio you get with just really common hunter-gatherer foods, steak and eggs. If you kill an animal and eat the whole thing, you're getting a protein energy ratio of about 2-to-1. which is awesome. If you threw some fruit or vegetables in there, it's closer to about 1-to-1, and that's kind of perfect. And I think that's a really great maintenance place to be for most people.
That's great. So a couple of other things I'd like to talk about. So first of all, would you talk about how much protein an individual needs? You've got a method for working that out. So how many grams of protein someone should be getting per day?
Right. Okay. So now I don't think anybody really has to necessarily track out everything. I really don't want any of my patients, for example, to have to weigh and measure all their food and exactly calculate everything out. But I definitely want people to have a good ballpark feel for how much protein they should eat. And I typically recommend a gram per pound per day of ideal body weight, which is like your ultimate goal body weight, or what you should weigh, or your reference weight for your height. Like, for example, I'm a 5'10", 5'10" tall. And basically, if you look up the ideal body weight for a 5'10" male, it's 160 pounds. So I would roughly want to target 160 pounds per day. And so you're kind of trying to eat a gram per pound. I know it's a little bit different if you're using centimeters and kilograms, but and then you have to kind of be familiar with, well, how much grams of protein is in a food. Basically, a pound of leanish meat is about 100 grams of protein. So a pound of lean ground beef would be 100 grams of protein. A pound of just whole chicken or turkey would be 100 grams of protein. Really lean protein like white fish would be higher, maybe 120 grams per pound. But you're talking about a pound of meat being roughly 100 grams of protein, and that'll kind of get you in the ballpark. If you're a female who's 5'4" and you should weigh 120 pounds, so that's roughly 100 grams of 120 grams of protein, which is a little bit over a pound of meat a day, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So for New Zealand listeners, we're really looking at 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, roughly.
Roughly, yeah, exactly. Roughly 2 grams per kilogram of what you should weigh. If you're
ideal body weight, yeah,
150 kilograms, you should weigh, 70 kilograms. And so it would be 2 grams per kilo of what you should weigh. So if you're a 70 kilo average male, you'd want to be eating 140, 150. It's really 2.2 is the conversion. So like maybe 150 grams of protein.
And what about dividing that up into meals? We have the leucine threshold. So, sort of essentially we need 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per protein bolus, So we're looking at roughly, maybe 30 grams of protein per meal or a little bit more.
Right. I don't really sweat that too much because I have patients with such a wide variety of eating windows. So I have patients who just eat once a day, one giant meal a day, and they eat all their protein in one huge meal. And these people are fine. So obviously that's possible. I'm quite certain that in the past, in the Paleolithic, I'm sure humans were eating just a massive meal and then maybe not eating for a whole day or two. And so it has to be possible to meet your protein needs with one meal a day. I don't think that's necessarily optimal. And if you're a competitive bodybuilder, as you get leaner and leaner and leaner, you want to eat protein more and more frequently. So if you're a bikini competitor and you're 18% body fat and you're trying to get down to 14%, okay, now you might want to eat 3, 4, 5 meals a day with at least 30 grams of protein each. But your average person could just do intermittent fasting, fast for 16 hours, eat 2 meals and a snack in an 8-hour window, and then they could eat, 50 grams of protein in those two main meals and then a snack or something like that. So yeah, I would say though, if you're looking at it from just a traditional 3 meals a day, 12-hour eating window, you would want to get at least 30 grams of protein per meal, probably more like 40.
Right. Okay. That's good. That's good ballpark figures for people. So there's a lot of discussion about protein being dangerous, myths about cancer, osteoporosis, kidneys, gout. Would you address that a little bit? Talk about,
Oh, sure. Absolutely. All right. So historically, we've felt that protein was really hard on your kidneys. And it's true that protein is, you have to use your kidneys more when you eat protein. It's more work for your kidneys, but that's actually good for your kidneys. In high protein diets, the kidneys actually get larger and stronger and better. And so protein's actually working the kidneys, but in a good way. It would be like if you did a lot of running, your legs would get stronger and literally better. That's what protein is like for your kidneys. So protein does not harm your kidneys at all. There are 0 cases in the medical literature of protein ever harming anyone's kidneys. In the entire history of medical literature, we have no case reports of bodybuilders, for example, some of whom are eating just incredibly stupendous amounts of protein. No one's had a kidney injury or kidney problems from excessive protein. So it's totally mythical that protein harms your kidneys. Even in people with kidney dysfunction, we've historically always recommended protein restriction for these people, but there's almost no evidence to support that. The vast majority of people who have kidney failure to some degree do not benefit from protein restriction. In fact, meta-analysis showed that about 93% of people with chronic kidney disease do not benefit at all from protein restriction. And so it's extremely rare. Only men with primary glomerular disease have been ever shown to benefit from protein restriction at all. And even then, the benefit was microscopic. So this is extremely mythical. Like the fact that your average person who has kidney dysfunction due to high blood pressure or diabetes, they're probably going to actually benefit from a higher protein percentage in their diet. So the thought that they should restrict protein is really kind of mythical. Gout is sort of the same story. So historically, we've told people, if you have gout or high uric acid, you don't want to eat very much protein. That's really not true. And in fact, in a study where they took men with high uric acid levels and gout and put them on an Atkins diet where they literally increased their protein intake, everyone's uric acid levels went down and everyone's gout got better. And so the reality is that metabolic syndrome and being over fat is what causes hyperuricemia. Insulin, if you're hyperinsulinemic because you're over fat, insulin prevents the kidneys from excreting uric acid properly. So anyone who's over fat is going to have high uric acid and be at risk for gout. So what you really want to do is just get thinner. And the best way to do that is actually a higher protein percent diet because you get so much more satiety per calorie. So the same thing is true of your cancer risks. So being over fat, being on the insulin resistance spectrum dramatically increases your risk for cancer. Type 2 diabetics have more than doubled their risk for all these cancers: breast, colon, endometrial, prostate cancer. All of these cancers are driven by hyperinsulinemia, and just being over fat will give you high insulin levels all the time. And that's way more cancerogenic than eating protein. Protein will spike your insulin transiently, but overall it just makes you thinner. So your basal insulin is actually way, way lower. Your total insulin exposure is much lower if you eat more protein because you have higher satiety per calorie, and then you're thinner, and then your basal insulin is lower. So protein has never been proven to increase your risk for cancer or your risk for kidney problems. And it's not dangerous if you have kidney issues to begin with. And we've told people for a number of years that protein's bad for your bones, that protein's acidic and it will leach calcium out of your bones and melt your bones. That's actually the exact opposite of the truth. And in fact, the more protein you eat, the better your bone density is going to be. And that is because your bone is 50% protein and 50% minerals. So there's this protein matrix that the minerals are placed in that make up your bone. And in fact, even if you have high bone mineralization, your bone is going to be more brittle and less flexible if you're on a low protein diet. And you're actually more likely to break something, even if your bone density looks good from a mineral standpoint. So the more protein you eat, the better it is for your bones. Literally, the better it is for your kidneys. The thinner you're going to be and the lower your overall insulin exposure is going to be. And there's pretty much no downsides to eating protein at all. Anything we've ever said historically about protein being bad is basically mythical and fraudulently wrong and based on no actual evidence.
It's hard to get that message out there, but I think it is starting to expand a little bit more, and people are getting more aware of it. Certainly talks like these help get the message out to the public, I think.
Good.
So you're talking about being over fat and the insulin response to that. So I've heard you talk about that before, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. So there's an insulin response to being over fat, not just to consuming carbohydrates in our diet. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Absolutely. Right. So you have these subcutaneous fat cells under your skin, right? And they can all expand to maximum diameter. Once you've expanded them all to the highest diameter, then you have to sprout new baby fat cells under your skin. Now, everyone has a genetically inherited ability to sprout new fat cells. And some people's ability to sprout new fat cells is extremely low. And they have what is called a low personal fat threshold. People from Southeast Asia, for example, if you're from India or one of these countries, you might not be able to expand your number of fat cells very much at all. And what happens is once you've sprouted all the fat cells you can under your skin, and once they're all expanded to their maximum diameter, which is around 200 microns, then your body's forced to store fat in your visceral cells. And at this point, none of your cells want this fat. And so your insulin level starts going up higher and higher and higher, because the job of insulin is to clear energy out of your bloodstream and shove it into cells for storage. So it's like blowing up a balloon. Once you get to the upper limit of the size the balloon can reach, you have to constantly blow into it as hard as you can. And the second you stop blowing, all the air comes rushing out of the balloon. Your fat storage is the same way. Like a type 1 diabetic. If you're a type 1 diabetic and you don't take your insulin, what immediately happens is every bit of fat in all your fat cells just comes rushing back into your bloodstream. And you literally melt down all this energy in your body. It eventually ends up as glucose, but you're melting down all your stored energy into burnable energy in your bloodstream. Insulin is like a fuel sensor in your bloodstream. And whenever the fuels in the bloodstream goes up, insulin shoves all the fuels back into storage where they're supposed to stay. So your fat is constantly trying to come out of your fat cells, but insulin's shoving it back in there like a dam that's holding back water. Once you fill the dam up to the very, very brink, which is what happens if you fill up all your subcutaneous fat cells and all your visceral fat cells, and now you've got ectopic fat in your liver and your pancreas. And once you've shoved in all this fat everywhere, the dam of insulin you're secreting 24/7 to hold back all this energy, to hold it into circulation, is very, very high. So like, for example, my fasting insulin level might be a 1 or a 2. I could have a hugely overfat pre-diabetic or diabetic come in, and their fasting insulin level might be 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 70, or I think 90 is the highest one I've ever seen. And then when these people eat, their insulin goes up by a factor of 10 or 20 or 30. So you just have this massive, massive wall of insulin at all times that goes up even higher after you eat, as your body's desperately trying to keep all this energy stored and out of your bloodstream. And that's why hyperinsulinemia is energy toxicity. You've literally shoved too much energy into your body.
Oh, that's a fabulous explanation. It's quite scary, actually.
Mm-hmm. It is.
It is. So what about people who have been overweight or obese for a long time? You know, like the struggle of trying to reduce weight, and then sort of the long-term effects of the energy toxicity. Is that a problem?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of problems there. First of all, if you've proliferated your number of fat cells, you've really, really affected how lean you can get in the future. So let's say I only have 10 fat cells on my whole body, right? I can diet down to the point where all 10 of those cells are maybe half full. And I can walk around that way. I'm fairly comfortable. If I try to diet down to where these cells are 10% full of fat, I will be starving out of my mind 24/7. My leptin is the factor there, right? So leptin will be so low that you're just absolutely starving. So I can basically shrink my fat cells down to maybe the 50% level, kind of like the gas tank in your car. And my fat cells are okay with that. I can sort of walk around that way and I'm fine. But if I was on, my 600-pound life, this show, and I have 1 billion fat cells, well, I can shrink all my fat cells down to this 50% level, and maybe I'll lose 300 pounds. But if I try to go below that, I'm just extremely hungry, and it's just a real struggle. So the reality is that if you've ever been really over fat, you're never going to get quite as lean as someone who is never over fat to begin with. Now you can shrink down your fat cells so much that your insulin is actually down to normal and your blood sugar is down to normal and you're metabolically quite healthy, but you'll still visibly have a higher body fat percentage than someone who was just always thin their whole life. So once you have been over fat, it's a lot harder to get really low body fat levels, but you can still achieve a very healthy metabolism, even if you have more fat cells than other people. It's like someone who lost a lot of weight and they have all this excess skin sitting around and they have to have skin removal surgery. Sort of the same concept where you're just going to have a little bit more body fat than people who are never over fat to begin with.
Right. So what you're talking about there is sort of the set point theory a little bit too, isn't it?
Correct. Right.
Innate control system that wants to keep us at a certain set point.
Right.
So with our children then, we really want to be avoiding allowing them to get over fat.
Oh, yeah, you're really just kind of screwing them over for life if they get extremely over fat in adolescence. It's really an uphill battle long term. Eventually, if the amount of available energy is really low, some of these fat cells do go away, but it takes about a decade for that to happen. So it's a real struggle for at least a decade, if not lifelong, for some of these kids. So yeah, it's definitely something to avoid if at all possible.
So what advice would you give to parents about feeding their children? Do you have I guess they need more energy than adults do, but you would still work on a protein energy ratio for them?
Correct. Right. So kids have a much higher carbohydrate tolerance than adults, and they also are growing, so they need more energy. But I would actually do the same thing with kids that I would recommend for adults, and that's protein prioritization to make sure you're hitting your protein and mineral satiety at the lowest energy intake you can get away with. So basically, the way that looks in the real world is every meal is centered around protein, and every snack is centered around protein. It's all about the protein. Where is the protein? Breakfast should be, eggs and turkey bacon or lean meat of some kind. Lunch should be, something with lean meat, green vegetables, cheese, cottage cheese, unsweetened yogurt, something that has protein as a primary macronutrient. So every time you eat, you're focusing on protein. Now, if kids are at an ideal body weight and they've eaten this protein and they're still starving, oh yeah, they can get away with a lot more carbs and even fats than adults can. But you're trying to prioritize the protein first and foremost, so these kids can hit nutrient satiety at a lower energy intake. It's like if all you feed them is goldfish crackers or some abomination. I don't know if you guys have those there, but if you just feed kids something like this, that's a refined carb and a refined fat, some sort of sugar, flour, oil concoction, they are going to eat 1 billion calories and they're still going to be hungry for protein and minerals. So they'll just eat and eat and eat and eat until they get what they need. And in the process, they're going to massively overeat non-protein energy. So the question is, how much energy did they have to eat through to get the protein and minerals they needed for satiety in the first place? And you just prioritize that on the front end, and then they end up eating less energy on the back end.
And what about aging? Do our protein needs increase as we age, or do you think that your percentages or your ratios cover that off, body weight, how many grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, does that cover that as we age, or do we need to concentrate a bit more on protein as we get older?
Well, a gram per pound would work for anybody at any age. But the reality is that as you get older, your need for protein just goes up your whole life. Older people have anabolic resistance and they need more protein. They need a higher absolute protein. They need a higher protein percentage. And so, yeah, your needs actually go up as you get older, which is really sad because protein intake tends to go down in older people in this country, which might explain why we have such a massive epidemic of sarcopenia and osteopenia and frailty and all of these. Everyone's type 2 diabetic, everyone has sarcopenic obesity, everyone has osteoporosis, and it's just a frailty epidemic in the elderly. And the average American age 70 to 79 is eating 68 grams of protein a day and only 38 grams of animal protein. And so they're just getting this starvation level amount of protein, but they're eating almost 300 grams of carbs. And as a result, they have sarcopenic obesity, which is basically low muscle, high fat mass, which is the recipe for type 2 diabetes and metabolic disease. And it's just a complete and total nightmare.
And in our old age home, that's what they feed them. It's always a biscuit for snacks and, dessert and bread and cereal and very low protein.
Oh, it's disgusting. And a lot of that is economic. Actually, it's almost purely economic, because if you graph out the price of every food in the grocery store, it's all about the protein. The price of every food goes up linearly with the amount of protein it contains in a perfectly straight line. Carbs and fats are almost free. They tend to not increase the price of the food at all. But if you're trying to just get protein, it's always the most expensive macronutrient. And so that's economics is hugely driving the diabetes epidemic, because nobody wants to pay for protein. Food should be cheap. And so we just buy carbs and fats.
Would you talk briefly about vegetable oils and, sort of omega-6 fats and sort of the toxic issues around some of these oils?
Sure. So if you look at hunter-gatherers, they are ingesting omega-3 to omega-6 fats at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So you get omega-3 fats from things like grass and plankton. And so any animal that's eating what it's supposed to eat, like a cow eating grass or any kind of quadruped ruminant animal eating grass, is going to have a very high omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, or any kind of wild-caught seafood that has plankton at the base of its food pyramid. It's going to have a really good omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So animals eating what they're supposed to eat have an excellent omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, almost 1-to-1. Wild seafood with plankton at the base, 1-to-1 ratio. Any kind of herbivore, omnivore, carnivore with grass on a terrestrial food basis ladder is going to have a really good ratio. The problem is when you just take part of a plant, like the nuts and the seeds. If you just look at nuts and seeds, they have a very high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and it's, it could be 20-to-1. And unfortunately, when you eat these fats, they get incorporated into your tissues, into your cell membranes, and into your connective tissue. And we know in the animal world that if you just eat pork, too many soybeans and too much soybean oil, for example, you end up with what's called soft pork. It's where the tissue quality of your pig is really, really poor because it's so filled with omega-6 fats. And the fat quality, the fatty acids you're eating get incorporated into all your cells and end up affecting your body. They can affect your cell membranes, your connective tissue, your mitochondria, and all sorts of things. So you really don't want half your body to be omega-6 fats, but we're just watching humans get a higher and higher and higher percentage of omega-6 fats in all of their tissues because we're basing so many of our food calories off of things like soybean oil or nuts and seeds and nut and seed oils, which have this crazy, crazy ratio. It's really something you want to pay attention to. That's why I think that industrial seed oils are really to be avoided. They're actually quite bad. You're getting way too much of this stuff in the standard American diet, and you really want to steer clear of it. The ways to do that are, first of all, avoid industrial seed oils like the plague, and secondly, go out of your way to eat animals that themselves were eating what they're supposed to be eating, which is basically grass-fed ruminants and wild-caught fish and seafood and pastured eggs and that kind of thing.
I think people don't understand too that animal foods are not only just made up of saturated fat, that there's a variety of fats in animal foods.
Right. Every food on earth has a pretty good smattering of monounsaturates, polyunsaturates, and saturated fat. And all three of those fats are in everything except for just sugar, which is unfortunately no fat at all, or except for something like certain nuts and seeds are really, really high in polyunsaturated. But yeah, you're right. Like pork fat, if you have pastured pig pork fat, it's basically kind of the same fatty acid profile as olive oil. So there's really not much difference there at all.
So we don't need to be terrified of eating the saturated fat, cutting it off our meat, unless we need a much lower energy intake.
Right. Yeah. As long as the animal is eating what it's supposed to eat, you don't really have to fear the fatty acid quality there. But again, you might not want to eat that much energy. And that's one of the things you have to watch out for. Domesticated animals, sometimes we just really, really, really fatten them up. So if you're eating bacon, you're eating the very fattest part of the fattest animal that's been artificially fattened. And so the protein energy ratio is kind of low. And you're not going to get the very leanest if that's all you're eating. Like just pure lard would probably be the worst, and bacon's not as good. But you eat something leaner, like, Canadian bacon or center cut bacon or ham or something, with a higher protein energy ratio, you're probably going to lose more weight.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I've got a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, what advice would you give to vegetarians and vegans? And I think it's great that you're an ex-vegetarian. Plant-based is becoming a very strong movement in New Zealand. A lot of concern about animal welfare and the planet. What would you say to vegetarians and vegans?
Well, okay. I'd start off by saying, first of all, why are you vegetarian or vegan? If you are an ethical vegetarian or vegan, you really might want to do your research into the exact number of animals that die using monocropping versus ruminant agriculture, for example. So, and you might want to also research exactly what the effect on the environment is. For example, ruminants, if you're properly raising cows, right? Ruminants eat wild grasses, they eat cellulose. A massive percentage of the land surface on Earth is covered with wild grass. The cellulose has literally no other purpose. No other animal can eat it or do anything with it. Humans can't really do anything with it. So they're not competing with the human food supply when they're eating wild grasses. A cow that's being properly raised on wild grassland is literally powered just by ambient sunlight and rainfall. This is completely energy neutral. In fact, they're better than carbon neutral because they sequester carbon dioxide in the soil. Wild grasses sequester a lot of carbon dioxide in their root systems. And so a cow eating wild grasses on pasture is better than carbon neutral, using only ambient sunlight and rainfall. And it's absolutely amazing in terms of regenerative agriculture versus monocropping, where you're literally destroying the topsoil. So the problem with monocropping is we destroy the land, kill all the animals that live on it, use a lot of pesticides and fertilizer, which comes from fossil fuels, by the way, and then you're basically just slowly destroying the topsoil. When you have a ruminant eating wild grasses, you're building topsoil. You're literally leaving the soil better than when you found it, versus monocropping, where you just slowly destroy the topsoil. So to start off with, if you're ethically going plant-based to save the environment, you really, really need to do more research on regenerative agriculture and properly raised ruminants. If you're eating for health reasons, there's basically no compelling reason to eat a pure plant-based diet. I mean, even in the Adventist health studies, adding fish, for example, to a vegetarian diet improved outcomes for vegetarian Adventists. So I would encourage anyone who's vegetarian to just find the animal foods that you do eat, that you are willing to eat, and eat a lot of those, because this is going to be your best source of protein. This is going to be your most bioavailable protein. Animal foods always have higher protein and higher nutrient density than plant foods, and this is just due to biomagnification. So for example, a plant is limited as to how far its roots can reach, and so the amount of minerals in a plant is limited, and the amount of protein in a plant is limited based on nitrogen availability. But a cow or an animal can walk around and eat thousands of plants, and they will bioaccumulate or biomagnify the minerals and the protein. So you get a much higher nitrogen to carbon ratio in an animal food and a much higher nutrient density, both protein and minerals, because it's higher on the food chain. That's just the way it works. So if you're a vegetarian, you want to find the few animal foods you're willing to eat and just eat the heck out of them. And then you want to make sure they're properly raised. Pastured eggs, pastured dairy, for example. For vegans, I highly recommend supplementation with protein. You want to go out of your way to eat some sort of protein supplement. Tofu is technically a protein supplement. Any kind of soybean product is a protein supplement. Wheat gluten is a protein supplement. You're basically looking for protein supplementation. It could be rice or pea or hemp or lentil or legume or soy or tofu or any kind of textured vegetable protein. But you're trying to increase the protein in your diet. any way you can. I don't think that's optimal because the amount of energy it takes to process plant proteins is quite bad for the environment in the big picture. If you look at the lifetime cycle analysis of energy requirements to make like tofu, for example, versus just a cow, one cow will feed one human for an entire year with like 500 pounds of usable meat. And you're only killing a single animal, and it's powered by sunlight and rainfall. But if you look at what it takes to monocrop a whole field of soybeans and how many animals you kill and how many nitrogen fertilizer products you have to use and pesticides, and then if you look at the processing and all the energy intensive processes it takes in the full life cycle to make your tofu, it's actually much, much higher than ruminant agriculture. It's much, much worse for the environment. You're actually not doing anybody any favors. But still, if you insist on being vegan because you love animals so much, and you're not going to be convinced otherwise, I do recommend going way out of your way to prioritize protein and get as much protein into your diet as you can.
And so would you be talking about sort of processed protein then? So sort of like soy protein replacement rather than, trying to eat soy itself. Is that what you're recommending? Or, hemp protein powder or something like that?
Yes, it could be both. So you could go out of your way to eat soybeans in any form, edamame, tofu, but you might also need a protein supplement like a hemp powder or a rice powder or a pea powder or a soybean powder. And I do have vegans who are very healthy, but most of them are supplementing with protein.
And what about things like B12 and other, micronutrients?
Right. So the micronutrients you're going to be low on a vegan diet is definitely B12, D, iron, and DHA, EPA, your essential fatty acids that you would normally get from, say, fish, for example. So you want to take some sort of algae-based essential fatty acid product. You want to take B12 for sure. You want to supplement with vitamin D. You want to supplement with iron. If you take all these supplements and if you supplement protein, you can be totally healthy on a plant-based diet. Unfortunately, it's way more difficult, way more complicated, and you don't really have any health benefits there, and you haven't really helped the planet because the energy-intensive processes that are required to refine all that crap is really astronomical compared to regenerative animal practices.
So this is a lot of the disinformation we've been fed, isn't it? Alternative.
Oh yeah, I was a vegetarian for 20 years, so believe me, I know all about both sides, and it's a lot of misinformation out there, and I used to believe it too. I mean, I just didn't know any better. I hadn't really researched it, and I just believed what everyone told me.
Thank you for that. So my second to last question is, as a medical doctor, how would people approach and talk to their GPs about using nutrition to improve their health rather than pharmaceuticals? In New Zealand, it's still pretty frowned upon. It's considered not really relevant, and people get quite frustrated. So how would you suggest, one, that they go and talk to their doctors about these things, and two, that they can get appropriate testing for things like triglycerides and insulin and glucose and, sort of inflammatory markers?
Well, a lot of my patients with, high blood pressure, for example, is part of the metabolic syndrome. So most people with high blood pressure just have insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes, of course, is just pure insulin resistance. And honestly, the day that my patients go on a well-formulated, high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet, the day they go on this diet, they literally have to cut a lot of blood pressure pills in half and a lot of oral hypoglycemic agents or insulin or something for type 2 diabetes. They have to cut these in half immediately, or they're literally going to be too low. Their blood pressure might be too low. Their diabetes might be too low. So you do have to work with your doctor and tell them, hey, I'm going to change my diet and I'm probably going to lose weight and I will probably have a lower need for these medications. And I think most doctors are totally okay with that as long as you're monitoring things on your own. If you have a home blood pressure cuff and if you have a glucometer at home and you're keeping an eye on these things, then you'll probably have to start cutting medications in half. And most doctors love it if you just monitor these things on your own and titrate your doses down if need be. And honestly, that's the way to go because, I'm sure your doctor cares about your health, but nobody's going to care more about your health than you. And nobody's going to have a better idea how much of these medications you need than you do. So the best way to go is monitor these numbers on your own and work with your doctor and titrate down on things. And the vast majority of medications that are prescribed by primary care doctors can be eliminated with enough dietary improvement and weight loss. So it's a massive amount of medications out there that can be de-prescribed when people lose weight and change their diet and lose weight. So you definitely want a doctor who will work with you. I think the really tricky one is statins for high cholesterol, because as you make all these improvements and all your numbers get better and better and better, your total cholesterol is probably not going to change much or go up slightly. And then some doctors can just never get past that. And if you have bad cardiovascular disease, I think you should probably take a statin. It does seem to have some anti-inflammatory properties. And I do prescribe statins to people who've had angioplasties, bypasses, stents, cardiovascular disease, known vascular disease. But if you're totally healthy and you have no vascular disease and you just have a high total cholesterol number, I'm not convinced that it's necessarily a good thing to be doing. And so at some point, you can just tell your doctor, look, just put in my chart that you recommended this medication and I just didn't want to take it. And we'll just, as long as you document that you offered it and I politely declined it, your doctor's going to be fine with that. My peers that I work with, if someone says, look, I understand you're recommending a statin and I just don't want to take it for whatever reason, just document that you recommended it and I politely decline, and we'll just move forward. And I would say, 99% of doctors are going to be fine with that. And they're really just trying to cover their ass with a lot of these statin prescriptions. And as long as you let them document that they offered it and you declined it, it's really not a big deal. And most people will just move on from there. So, I think that's my advice to people is just monitor everything, work with your doctor. And if they're really stuck on the statin thing, just tell them to document that they recommended it and you didn't want it.
That's a great bit of advice. Thank you. So my last question is I'd like to talk a little bit about your book. So a lot of what we discussed today is in your book, and you talk about the protein energy ratio. You have a section with some recipes and cooking, and then you've got exercise at the end. Do you want to expand on that a little bit for us?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, everything we've talked about today is in the book, and you can purchase the book at thepediet.com. The name of the book is The PE Diet, and it's at thepediet.com. And really, the big points of this book are, number one, prioritizing protein for satiety. Number two, do some sort of reduction in carbohydrate frequency so you're more fat adapted. That could be just eating carbohydrates once a day, or being on a low-carb diet, or intermittent fasting, or we talk about all the different strategies for lowering carbohydrate frequency. And then the other big pillar in the book is high-intensity exercise, brief, maximum intensity resistance training to put the highest amount of tension you can in all of your muscles to try to get as much lean mass as you can, because the whole goal in life is to get the highest lean mass at the lowest fat mass. So you have to generate this stimulus for muscle growth, and it's basically slow, perfect form, pushing, pulling, and squatting movements. So we talk about body weight exercises you can do at home, push-ups, push-up variations, pull-ups and rows and pulling variations, and different lunges and squats and other leg exercises. And so I'm encouraging people to do just these really short, we have this 7-minute workout in the book, this nano workout with just a single set to failure of pushing exercise, pulling exercise, and squatting exercise. And people can do this at any level. They can start out with a wall push-up if they can't do a regular push-up. There's basically infinitely scalable from the easiest exercise all the way up to the very hardest. And it's just a really easy way to get in the door of resistance training. And that's what we kind of outline in the book.
And maintaining that muscle mass is so important, isn't it, for health and longevity and, reducing that sarcopenia and all those things that we talked about. So.
Oh, yes. Muscle is the organ of longevity, and the stronger you are, the longer you're going to live. And so you really do want as much muscle as you can get.
And I think the little workouts that you've got in the back of the book, as you say, they're very scalable, 7 minutes. You can do them at home. You don't need to go and join a gym. You don't have to buy special clothes. You can just do it in your old trackies and shoes and,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, excellent. Is there anything else you would like to mention or talk about?
I don't think so. I'm sure I've probably bored people enough already.
I think people will be absolutely fascinated with what you've had to say. I really thank you for your time. You've given us an hour and a half today. That's incredibly generous of you for your time. And I absolutely encourage everyone to go and get your book. I really think that your book is so well balanced, and I just think everyone in the country would benefit from following your principles in that book.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.